10,
Yeah, sorry, I'm in
9.
I'm with all of the other.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this breakout section, Equity in the Arts, Part 2. I'm Jerome Weeks, Senior Arts Producer Reporter with KERA, the NPR affiliate in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I'd like to introduce our panel this afternoon. Alphabetically, John Hinojosa is the Executive Director of SACE in San Antonio. If you're not familiar with that group, it began as part of a neighborhood association with just 12 high school students. It's a tuition-free after-school art studio program that's gone on to be citywide and received national recognition. John, thank you. Terry Loftus is President and Executive Director of the Arts Community Alliance, or TACA, which is one of the largest arts fundraising groups in Dallas. Terry? And Vicki Meek, a longtime head of the South Dallas Cultural Center, an artist in her own right, and currently a member of the Arts and Culture Advisory Commission of the City of Dallas. Vicki? And Jennifer Scripps. She is the director of the Office of Arts and Culture of the City of Dallas. Thank you. Thank you for all being here and joining us. Quick little warning, my Wi-Fi has been occasionally iffy, so if I freeze or disappear, talk amongst yourselves. I'm certain the conversation will go on without me just as well. So thanks for doing this. And let's get to it. It seems to me that even in this, particularly in this year of so much ferment, of activism, that a lot of arts groups, much like a lot of corporations, are announcing programs. They're declaring their support for things like the Black Lives Matter movement. But what I haven't seen, at least in my experience of looking at the cultural scene in Dallas-Fort Worth, is I haven't seen an arts organization sort of fundamentally reforming its DNA, really changing its basic structures. And that would involve the board and patronage, funding, in other words. I was wondering, the people involved with funding here, particularly Jennifer, Terry, and Vicki, if you could tell me what can be done about that. How can that be encouraged, that kind of change?
Well, I don't mind jumping in first as the elder here. Many years ago, we had an initiative, which then was City Arts Program, to try to get organizations who were getting city funding to understand the need to represent the entire city, and that had to happen on more than just the programming level. That the idea of presenting programming and then saying, well, but we presented it and people didn't come, it comes from not understanding that it's a ecosystem that has to totally change. You said it, Jerome. The board has to be representative of that community. The staff has to be representative of that community, and particularly the staff that is doing curatorial work around aesthetics. Because when you have a community that you know nothing about, it's very difficult for you to be effective in programming for that community. You might pick some things that you think are right, and they may be totally wrong because you have absolutely no background in that particular ethnic group's aesthetic. So it is critical that when we look at the organization, we look at it from the top to the bottom and all around it, because that's what it takes for an organization. And they have to commit to that. I mean, the board has to literally commit to making those kinds of systemic changes. Otherwise, it's cosmetic. And oftentimes what happens is you might even have a leader who is really good at this and really, charismatic and all the things that you need to bring the community in. That leader leaves and the organization goes right back to what it was. So it really is incumbent upon the organization to make the total commitment to make the change.
But telling people to do that is not the same as perhaps encouraging, getting them to do that. It can arts funders, city funding, can that be a force for change in this area?
The city, and I agree with everything Commissioner Meek just said,
The city, with the cultural plan in 2018, does track board staff and audience on our ALANA variables, which stands for African, Latin American, Asian, Arab, Middle Eastern, and Native American. So it's very holistic. And we are seeing tremendous strides from the majors. Several organizations have had to do the work to change key leaders in their nominating committee. So to Vicky's point about leadership, it might be the chair, but if the nominating committee isn't truly invested in this, then the pipeline and the cultivation of donors and board members, it takes time. So it's not a surface level effort. And we are seeing progress, but again, I think the work will take time. But I also don't want to say that because then that lets people off the hook because they'll say, well, we're going to get to that later. I see an urgency, right? And a lot of what I hope that we're seeing too is people that are looking at the curatorial or the artistic collections and efforts that best reflect our full community, that those organizations see results insofar as that they have more engagement of members or their audiences grow or they win accolades, if you will, for new works. And we are seeing that. I think it's weird times right now with COVID, but several of our major organizations have really made efforts, and we have dinged organizations if they're in the bottom of the bucket. Those large organizations with budgets over 5 million, when their boards were not diverse, I've had those conversations where we said, you did see your funding go down because of this.
So they did pay a price.
Yes. Do I think at the time, this was the year before last, 2 organizations, why did we go down in funding? And we said, here's your scorecard. And do you know that you're at the bottom of the bucket for board diversity? Oh, yes. And so, they didn't appeal it beyond that. And it wasn't hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm in no way saying but it did send that message. And I think it's trying to put teeth behind just words.
I've heard of these kinds of programs where board members are actually sort of educated because diversity, it requires work. I think whether it's racism or not, there's a tendency amongst people naturally to essentially boards to replicate themselves. I'm excited about this arts group or this director or whatever, and so I go to my friends and get them excited about it, and so they tend to replicate their own DNA, as it were. And so it actually takes a certain degree of work, of awareness and knowledge to get out of that, to go somewhere else. Are those the kinds of things that arts funding groups encourage, or is it something that the organization has to do internally?
Well, both. I think from Taka's perspective, which is much similar to Jennifer's setup with the City of Dallas, we do in our grants application process, there is a section to where applicants have to give the makeup of their board of directors. And to Jennifer's point, you'll see some of the larger institutions that are moving in that direction. But what COVID has done, so before the murder of George Floyd, we were this racism issue is not anything new. It has its peaks and valleys. And what Floyd's murder did was take it from a peak and take it from a valley to a peak and kept it there. So between a pandemic and the ongoing racial tensions in our society, it forced a lot of institutions to organically finally stop and start looking at the makeup of their organizations from the board level, from the staff level, beyond optics. Because I think that Vicki, Jennifer, John, and Jennifer would agree that up until now, no one was going to say, oh, we don't have some sort of initiative to reach out to become more diverse. But a lot of that is optics. So what we've seen with some of our beneficiaries is outreach to us on, we're serious about this. How can we diversify our board, and how can Taka help us do that? And my first question is this an optics play, or are you seriously considering, because Vicki said something very interesting, it has to be in the organization's DNA to make change. And it's a process, not an event. So while Jennifer said, it's not something that a lot of organizations can turn on a dime and do. If the intent is to change, and that intent is real, then there are organizations like TACA and others that are here, Communities Foundations of Texas, to help organizations seek out diverse individuals to put on their board. But again, my big point is it has to be more than optics. You have to be seriously, and your intention has to be sincere, but it also has to make sense for the organization. So it's more than just having a diverse board. Those board members have to align with the mission of the organization, have some sort of skill set that is going to benefit the organization. So that's why when I say it's a process, not an event, it is more than just identifying people of color to serve on boards. It's what are they going to do once they're there?
So it's not a case of the TACA would say target grants, saying you will get this grant if you diversify your board. It's rather that you see the diversity of the board as part of a larger picture of the health and purpose and intention of the organization.
Yes. For example, there's a new BIPOC coalition that was started in Dallas. And as much as we commend that is not, several folks have reached out to me to see if TACA would become a part of that organization. And we cannot, because our purpose of being is to make money available to the cultural arts. And we do that and continue to do that, whether or not, let me say it this way, a grantee is not going to get dinged for funding from us if they are not. What they are going to hear from us is, you really need to diversify your board. And I've said this to my own board and my own staff. TACA doesn't get an A+ because the new head of the institution happens to be a person of color. So by virtue of the fact that I was hired, doesn't mean that TACA as an institution gets to check that box off in totality. There's still work that we do. And it has to be an ongoing effort, but we will not refuse funding to an institution that desperately needs funds based on that, but we definitely will make it a point to say, here's where you need to do some serious work, and it has to be more than optics.
John, you had your hand up?
Yeah, so I'm not a funder, but I can talk about it from the context of the work that we do and sort of the understanding of how arts nonprofits really need to reflect their community. And so San Antonio is a bicultural city. It's not a multicultural city. It's our largest population is Latino, but actually Mexican American based on our proximity to the border. I happen to be a brown person. I happen to be a third generation Mexican American. I run an organization that serves urban inner city economically disadvantaged youth. And our commitment and our focus has always been to reflect our community. So what that means is, and it takes effort and time, and this is the other sort of context and difficulty for it, that means that our board contains influencers and people with power and funding, but it also includes our alumni and parents and others that are reflected of our community. Our vice president happens to be an alumni who's an architect. So the context is you've got to make a commitment to do that outside of whether you're going to get funding or not. And I'm proud of what Black Lives Matter and other sort of equity issues have done for our community. I'm just a little worried that it's going to be tokenism and not real change. And that's where we have to look at this. The other piece that we have to recognize as well is that giving people that don't have power, you have to be prepared to give them the strength, education, and understanding to take advantage of that power. So what you have to do is you have to make a commitment to professional development. The other piece that we have in this country and in San Antonio and in Texas is that we do not create a springboard for leadership of people of color. So now that we're talking again about where's your people of color on your board? Well, or why aren't you looking for a staff or a director that is a person of color? We need to spend some time rethinking our educational system, our commitment, the opportunities for arts leadership as part of this work, and build and grow these opportunities, because the thing that I'm worried about is that while we're reflecting this opportunity is let's diversify, let's change, that idea of let's bring some folks in so that our board or our staff looks different without giving them the skill sets or without giving them the education to be able to do that is problematic.
And I really, oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I want to echo what John is saying and talk about the way in which technical assistance for arts organizations and individuals does really promote what you're talking about. Because once upon a time, there was a lot of emphasis put on technical assistance for developing arts organizations. And over time, that kind of support dried up. You know, you didn't have too many people doing that. I used to run what is now the Contemporary, Dallas Contemporary, but at the time was D-Art Visual Arts Center. And one of the first things I put on the table was a series of workshops for artists to learn how to be in the business of art. And then we did all kinds of things around, you know, how do you attract investors in certain types of things that were entrepreneurial. So, you know, all of those kinds of training for being in those positions of power are essential, because, you know, you like you said, it'll become tokenism if you have people sitting on that board who don't really have the power to do anything more than be a face, you know, a colored face on that board. In fact, I had some friends who were actually very powerful people in this city who got off of certain major arts boards because they said they were not going to be a token. And that's what they were, given the fact that they weren't on the acquisitions commission or they weren't on the court, you know, they didn't have the powerful positions in those organizations. So we do have to invest in that kind of training as well.
Jennifer, you were gonna?
I agree, and Vicki was speaking about empowering arts organizations and artists in particular, but just the staff of institutions is way too white. And you know, I look back on things 10 years ago that I did not question, like unpaid internships, and how they were for so long, you know, given to people, and that is so inequitable because you're presuming that that person has another way to pay their bills or buy lunch or get gas to get to work. And those sorts of things then accrete to resumes that help them get in the door for the paid jobs. So I look at that whole pipeline, starting probably with elementary arts education and programs like Say See, that how do you open our whole industry to an ever widening, more representative workforce. And we know that these are good. We want to get the creative economy going, right? And it's been booming in Dallas, Fort Worth, but I see that too as part of this whole equity lens, but also it ultimately is the future of our institutions.
I wanted to go back to something that Terry brought up almost in passing, and that was COVID and the current situation there. Because you brought it up in interesting context, you saw COVID as a potential engine for change in this. Whereas I would fear that it would be the opposite, that when organizations are facing existential crisis in terms of survival, that they're not going to want to, oh, let's take on this extra burden. I did a story today, it aired, in which they talked about 1.4 million jobs have been lost in the cultural sector. Jennifer's lost half her staff. So I'm curious, Terry, what you were saying about COVID actually encouraging this. I'm wondering if you could explain that more.
Sure. So what we witnessed early on, we were talking offline before we went live today about the fact that the last large-scale event that was held in Dallas before Judge Jenkins shut down Dallas was our Silver Cup luncheon back in March. And within 48 hours of that luncheon, the city was shut down. And we were actually contacted after the fact and told, you know, you were it. So, so from that point forward, what we saw within our portfolio, within our universe, I'll say, is the immediate impact of programming being canceled, furloughs, layoffs, the government coming in with its PPP funding, and TACA responded with the emergency fund that we had there for a little bit. But then we had to think about what's beyond the emergency crisis part of this. Organizations have to move forward at some point at a level that is safe for them, safe for performers, for artists, and for patrons, whether that's digitally or limited in-person programming. So we started to see program shifts within institutions that were reflecting what is happening right now. And then you saw a shift internal to a lot of organizations, which were, we were not equipped either from a staff perspective or a board perspective to deal with something like this. So as we are making plans for the future, how do we do so, making sure that we have the right skill set that is competent, intelligent, and diverse, so that when we come out of this, the organization can be better than it was before this started. So I'm not sure it was intentional, Jerome, but we did start seeing a shift, especially with several theater companies that we fund that reached out to say, this is forcing us to reevaluate our entire, again, the phrase that Vicki used, our entire DNA on not only programming, but what our staff looks like, what our board is going to look like. So don't know, like I said, I don't know it was intentional, but it has definitely fueled some of the shifts and changes we're seeing take place.
There's the old saying about you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
That change can happen more quickly than when everyone's fat and happy, despite one's usual assumption that it's better to do this when you have a certain amount of financial security. But it still strikes me that for many people, especially as COVID closures extend well into next year, whether it's they're Black, white, or Latino, for many artists, it's going to be a question of jobs, and that becomes an issue of do I remain in the arts at all, no matter what my skin color, no matter what my culture is, and I see that as a potential wall that many of the organizations might hit. If you're trying to hire people to make your staff more diversified, you're extremely fortunate at the moment that you can hire people.
Right.
Well, and I think we're also vulnerable as an industry. If we're 4.5% of the economy, and that's nationally, why aren't we getting some of the federal relief and other relief packages on a sustainable, I'm thinking of the airlines. There is such a need for some real big relief in the next federal package, because even if the actors can eke out a living somehow, if the theaters are all closed for a year and can't reopen because it's so expensive, and they can't reopen at 25% of house, we've got real problems. So some of the macro needs I'm really watching for, that Save Our Stages bill and some of the relief that needs to occur and our industry is absolutely worthy of it. We're just fragmented, and unlike the airlines, we don't have paid lobbyists in DC working, all the time. So that is very needed, such that we have a fertile ground when it's safe for people to come back.
And I can also
sure, go ahead.
Into that conversation that what Jennifer is having, is that to me that also sort of underscores some policy issues that need to occur around advocacy and the way in which the arts really lack in that area. I mean, I used to work with visual artists, and the joke was, it's like herding cats. Trying to get them to understand the need to come together, to speak, with one voice around certain issues is really difficult. We have advocacy groups, but I don't think that we have enough understanding of how we need to really be developing advocates amongst more than just those professional groups. John, you were going to add to that?
Yeah, again, lots to say on this. The couple of pieces, just really quickly. as an artist masquerading as an arts administrator, I get that whole perspective and I understand it. The piece that as an organization that has retained some of its staff, and though we had to furlough, the piece is that we're looking at these opportunities. So we were one of the first in San Antonio to apply for the PPP loan. We were first to apply for the Bexar County and the city COVID dollars, and we're able to get them. So one piece is that I'm paying attention, I'm looking at opportunities. The problem that we have is smaller grassroots organizations. So when we talk about equity in the arts, they don't have sometimes the skill set, sometimes the ability, and they're trying to get everything done. So one of the things that we have to figure out is and remind how we get to those folks. The other thing with artists who are the gig economy, and as you said, it's herding cats, but the piece of it is they make our organizations run. And they are so important. So one of the things that I did, and again, when it's talking about action items, I created a Facebook page for artists and patrons to come together. But then the other piece that ended up happening, because there was funding in our city for rent and utilities and other things, I spent a lot of time working with artists to submit their applications, because there is a bureaucracy that happens. That most, artists have trouble keeping their 1099s together versus working and applying for a grant. So that's the other change that we have to look at when we talk about equity. So I'm really proud that of the 5 artists that I work with, they each got a grant. I shared with them the way that the city, the fact that they were giving rent and utilities, but it was a complicated process to get to, is sort of unfair. And so it is, again, the sort of radical change in thinking when we talk about those people that don't have the kind of equitable opportunities that others do.
We've been talking about primarily about civic funding and also internal questions of patronage and board members. I'd like to turn to corporate patronage. It's interesting that we have 2 different cities represented here with very different corporate cultures. San Antonio, as I understand it, has no Fortune 500 corporate headquarters. And tourism is what really drives the economy there. Meanwhile, Dallas has one of the largest collections outside of the city of New York, and yet we tend to be corporate poor when it comes to patronage of the arts locally. It seems to me that right now is the time to go to them and say, you put a marker down. I mean, when Target and Google and Facebook are running ads constantly about how they support Black Lives Matter, for instance, they're making these public declarations. AT&T, General Motors have all run ads to this effect. Well, if it's more than just advertising, if it's more than just a public relations gimmick, then you need to do something. And here it's something. I mean, I'm surprised that people haven't started to do that. Otherwise, it's just, you can call them on the public hypocrisy.
I think there are people doing that, not as a collective necessarily, but certainly there are organizations that are taking advantage, so to speak, of the moment. But I also want to make the point that across the nation, corporate giving to the arts is the smallest amount of giving. That is not where the major money is coming from for most of the art economy. It comes from individuals and it comes from some foundations. Even the foundation support is not the major thing. It's primarily individuals. Right. And I think that one of the things that we have to understand is that as we're beginning to talk about equity in the arts and all of these things around how do you make that happen, that a missing piece is the cultivation of donors of color, which we're beginning to see more of. We are definitely beginning to see more of that, these giving circles that are becoming a thing. But we have to begin to understand that those communities, they have money, but no one's necessarily talking to the people in those communities with money to say culture is as important as the church, as the sororities and the fraternities, as the social clubs. You know, we're not talking about those things in the way that will get them to begin to invest in the arts in the way that they have in education. I mean, you don't have to tell any Black person about the United Negro College Fund. They all understand that. They all know that's a good thing to give some money to, you know, but Ask them about, a theater company, ask them about Negro Ensemble, they never heard of them. So these are some things that we have to really begin to work at from our community standpoint of understanding that it's individuals who primarily support the cultural sector. Now, I'm not saying that I think that's the right way to do it, because I do feel like other countries have it right when they talk about, the government is really the one that supports that economy. But we know that in America, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So in lieu of that, we need to be investing in trying to get that kind of infrastructure around philanthropy in Black and Brown and Asian communities.
Well, John brought,
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jerome. No, I was just going to say, John brought something up that was very interesting about, community engagement. So even from a corporate perspective and an individual perspective, Vicky's right there. I've had multiple conversations with donors of color who probably have a perception that unless someone reaches out to me, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And as someone who grew up in the arts and studied the arts as a student, part of my sermon to people who will listen is, had I not been exposed to the cultural arts, I would not be the person I am today, regardless of the fact that I did not pursue a career in music, which is what I studied, by virtue of the fact that, my parents introduced music and dance and visual art and theater into our lives. It changed us. It made us who we are today. So when you talk about philanthropic giving, it has to be at a community level. And I encourage all people that I have an opportunity to speak with to give what they can philanthropically, because philanthropy doesn't just include the corporations, the high wealth individuals and foundations who can write large checks. We have to instill that throughout these communities at levels that people are comfortable doing, so they feel engaged and a part of this process, as opposed to, I can never go to the arts district to see a performance by the opera because either I can't afford it or it's inaccessible. Just real quick on the corporate side, Vicky's right. Across the country, corporations do what I call, and I'm not saying, I have to say this, no one in the Taka family, but corporations by and large do what my grandmother used to accuse some of her church fellow friends of doing, which is tipping in church as opposed to tithing. So corporations by and large, pre-post-COVID, have the resources, especially the larger ones that are based here, to really make a difference in the arts. But some of them are tipping as opposed to making substantial contributions. So what COVID did was highlight, from my perspective, and Jennifer's probably seen this as well, foundations who would typically always supporting the cultural arts started giving in some pretty significant ways. And we're very glad that they did. But right now, even during COVID, from our perspective, from Taka, you're seeing a lot of increased funding to us from high wealth individual givers and foundations. Corporations are always on the bottom of that rung.
There's an old saying I heard when I moved to Dallas about arts groups going to corporate patrons. And the saying was, you've generally heard the response, we'll write you a check if you don't ask us to come.
Yeah. Leave us alone.
Or they want a seat on your board.
Yes, John?
The things that I find is so ironic about our time and the focus is that, again, the arts are the first to get cut, the last to get funding, and yet through this pandemic, it is the arts that is healing everybody and helping everybody. And it's really, really disappointing. And that's why advocacy is so important. And that's why reminding folks, it is through, if it wasn't for the music that I was listening to and the work that I'm watching and the thing, and I know that everybody feels that way. And it's really disappointing because I don't know. So when we talk about advocacy, when we talk about equity, how do we get people to recognize and understand that? Because pre-COVID, it was like this. During COVID, it's like this. I'm afraid post-COVID, it's going to be the same thing.
I think there's a disconnect between what people enjoy as a national form of media, in other words, essentially the corporate arts, and what they see as local. I was constantly seeing Facebook posts in the last few months saying, if you're getting through this pandemic because of Netflix, thank an actor.
Yeah, it's a bit different than community theater at one of the cultural centers,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I will say though, this hybrid, the idea that people are getting comfortable watching things, I think they would still prefer it to be in person. The fact that we can go to our TV and stream something from the opera or a theater or dance has done great things in Dallas, does give me some hope that we'll be able to create a new business model. These arts groups will figure out a mix that works financially. So I'm still hopeful, but maybe it's trained some behavior. That's all I can say.
You know,
Yes.
that's a really good point that you're making, Jennifer, because I've been telling my artist friends, and I mean, you know, I'm an artist and I've looked at new ways of communicating as a result of not being able to go to a gallery or whatever. I think that the artists who are really stretching are figuring out that this thing might be something more valuable than they ever thought, which is that they're reaching audiences they never would have reached before.
Absolutely.
And in the case of many of the artists of color, they're reaching, because my thing used to always be, because I'm not from here, you know, and I never saw Dallas as having to answer all of my questions and, you know, desires. Many of the artists who were born and raised here thought that. But now what we're seeing is they're understanding there are people out there in other places that want to see what you're doing. So when I start, you know, sending out notices to my Facebook people, I know that I'm sending them to people who are all over the world. And therefore, these people are going to get exposure all over the world now, which if you think about it, we are a global economy. And so why shouldn't these small groups, just because they're small, why shouldn't they be also a part of that global economy by way of virtual programming?
Well, and the
I'd love to see that come back, but I
Right.
also don't want them to lose that idea that there's a bigger audience out there for you as well.
The
And the
question
fact
is
that
whether
you
you can
can
make
get
revenue
anything
off
you
of it.
want when you want it. Yeah.
The question is whether it can be a sufficient source of revenue, I think is why many of them worry about it. But to your point, Terry Teachout, the Wall Street Journal's theater critic, reviewed the Undermain Theater's recent live streaming of a play called St. Nicholas. And I've met Terry because he regularly travels around the country to see theaters. And he said, I've heard about Undermain for years. This was my first chance to see it. And he said, thus confirming my hope that theaters, when the pandemic is over, will continue streaming, because otherwise I never would have seen this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was a really remarkable thing on a national platform to hear from a critic saying that streaming in this sense was something that the theater should seriously consider pursuing afterwards.
I think we don't know, but this hybrid, I also, for baby boomers, as they inch closer to octogenarian decade, the idea that they are still loving an art form and not needing to dress up and drive downtown at night and are willing to support that. I mean, that's what I'm hearing from art leaders, that some of their most loyal and generous donors are getting comfortable with that. Does that help subsidize, you know, the live? So I'm hopeful that we can figure out a hybrid. And I also will say, I love that I can, you know, after the kids are in bed and the house is quiet, watch something on demand and not feel like I'm needing to make a curtain, get a babysitter, you know. So there's some pros. I of course would prefer to be live.
Right.
I miss
We've got about 5 minutes left, and John's had his hand up.
Yeah, my actual hand versus my virtual hand.
Yes.
Just really quickly on the piece. Here's the thing, and I think Jennifer's heard me before say this, just because we're both members of Texans for the Arts. The more successful organizations and individuals are not going to pivot. They've got to blow shit up and reimagine. That's how you're going to be successful in this current time. You have to rethink. You can't go back to the old ways. And it really is that way. And I think that we were successful in understanding that. It took a little bit of my staff some time to understand that just because we did it like that before isn't the way that we do it this way. The other thing that I'll say is that we've had 2 virtual fundraisers this year. We've raised more money because we don't have live events with catering and security, and it's just like, it's one of those things. And so I'm helping and mentoring a couple of other organizations is like, you can actually have more successful events. You've got to put more time into social advertising and getting the word out and everything else. But there is a sort of new opportunity that I think organizations and individuals that are really looking at this can.
I've heard that several times. Yeah.
Successful.
I want to return to quickly to the last question about funding, and it's something that we talked about when we spoke last week, and that is the issue of a major established arts organization looking for funding for a program that it's starting to help diversity and equity, and versus the small neighborhood grassroots program, maybe not as effective as the bigger one, but they've been in that neighborhood longer, they have the community ties. So essentially, who gets funded? And Vicki, last week you said you should never have an either or. It should never be either or.
I believe it.
And I understand that, but my question is, how do you prevent it from being an either or? Because you only have a limited pot of money. How do you prevent it from being, we give it to the big folks to diversify, or we give a lifeline to the neighborhood folks?
Those are policy issues. Those are the policy issues. I mean, those are the things that our Dallas Cultural Plan has been addressing, that we are not ever going to go back to the model where only the major institutions, because they can show the numbers, are the ones that get the money, because the numbers may not reflect depth. You know, I mean, you can have 100,000 children come through a museum, but if that doesn't translate into them becoming regular museum goers, but the people in the cultural center in their little neighborhood, or the people who are the artists who are working in that little neighborhood do have them charged up and, you know, wanting to do art, then who's more effective? You know what I'm saying? It's like, so we have ways of looking at who's effective that goes beyond the numbers game and the amount of money spent on certain things.
But so much of the funding, the city funding, is tied up with buildings. So it automatically gives the established organizations a certain amount of, they're getting
We are
cash
definitely
flow.
actively trying to wean ourselves, at least off of, the Meyerson has been reworked such that we'll be out from under that one. That will save the city over $1 million a year, freeing it up to put it into neighborhoods and organizations working in outside the arts district, say. But I mean, Dallas, there's no question we over-indexed in that historically in buildings.
Okay.
And it's also about community again. You know, John opened that door, and I keep wanting to go in it. It is large organizations, and you know, we're in Dallas, so we'll start here, but I'm sure John can speak to this in San Antonio. The brick and mortar institutions that have the subscriber base, the big donors, and the real estate, it is incumbent upon them and funders, whether that be TACO or the City of Dallas or the Moody Fund, to encourage them to spread those tentacles out into all facets of the community, to where that difference is being made, to where funding, you may be writing a check to the Dallas Symphony Orchestra to support their South Dallas initiative. And they've got a very good program that they're running doing that. But what I'm seeing from my counterparts that run some of the big institutions in Dallas is this renewed and permanent sense of community, to where we have to take the arts into these communities and not expect these individuals in these communities to come to the arts district. But beyond that, they have to help support other arts organizations that are already in these communities through collaboration and partnership and funding. So it's not just we're the big guys and we're going to go out and do programming in depressed areas of the city. We're also going to do that and support theater companies that are in these communities, visual artists that are in these communities, musicians, dance companies. So it has to be a holistic approach. And again, COVID and the upheaval of, 400 years of systematic racism is making organizations really take notice in a way that the optics are finally being dropped, and you have artistic directors and executive directors looking at, and CEOs looking at this going, we've got to do more. And hopefully that's, again, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's happening.
I've been given a signal that we need to wrap up here. I'd just like to say that I had approached this topic with a great deal of misgivings and doubt and worry. That I just wrote a story, as I said, about the arts sector in the U.S. losing $15 billion over the next year. But you have given me a certain degree of hope, and this would have been much better if we'd done it in person.
Yeah.
Always.
So thank you very much. It was good to see you all. Good to meet you, John,
Thank you.
even virtually. Jennifer, Terry, Vicki, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I think
All right.